Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. Glad you could join me today because I have a really super show in line here for you. I want to thank first, though, Ken Quiethawk for his amazing intro. You can find him on the internet under Native Storytellers. He and his wife have a magnificent way of preserving history, and since so much of the show is about preserving history, how it's been preserved, certainly looking into what the Native Americans have used for their history and preservation of their cosmology is definitely a direction everybody should go. And in many ways, the Native Americans have a better way of preserving than we do because their stories are far more interesting than the textbooks, which are fast becoming antiques and not being used much anymore at all. I have as a guest tonight Mark Carlotto. He is an aerospace engineer with over 30 years of experience in satellite imaging, remote sensing, signal and image processing, pattern recognition, and app development. He received a PhD in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and has published over 100 technical articles and written 6 books. Before Atlantis is the one we're going to be talking about tonight. And for that book, he draws from his unique background and experience, proposed new answers to basic questions concerning human origins, ancient technology, and archaeological enigmas. It sounds very heavy-duty technical, and I promise you it's not. His book is just an enlightening book, and it's one that I think everybody should read. Let me give you a little capsule. What if ancient sites such as Machu Picchu, Chichen Itza, and Acropolis, the Temple Mount, are not only thousands of years old, but much, much older? Until recently, a lack of hard evidence has led mainstream archaeologists to dismiss theories of past civilizations as pseudoscientific attempts to resurrect ancient myths and legends. However, I love the however, new archaeological discoveries continue to challenge conventional explanations. Inspired by Charles Hapgood's hypothesis that ice ages were the result of shifts in the geographic location of Earth's poles, independent researcher and author Mark Carlotto has discovered that certain archaeological sites throughout the world are aligned to what appeared to have been 4 previous positions of the North Pole over the last 100,000 years. By analyzing their geometry, he argues that these sites were built tens of thousands of years ago by an unknown prehistoric civilization who aligned them relative to the position of the North Pole at the time of construction. Destroyed and rebuilt many times over, what exists today are more recent structures that were built over and around the ruins of earlier structures, preserving the layout and orientation of the original site to the older pole. Before Atlantis considers the possibility that a previous technological civilization could have developed from an earlier migration of modern humans out of Africa, which later coexisted with our primitive hunter-gatherer ancestors and that past encounters with the older civilization were the source of ancient myths and legends of powerful gods, lost continents, and even perhaps Atlantis. The book is amazing. I highly recommend it, and I welcome you to the show, Mark. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Hi, Barbara. Nice to be here.
Well, your book got me. It really did. I had you have come up with a philosophy, a theory, and a scientific fact that, while I knew about it, I had never put it together with ancient sites and the shifting and things like that. So for those who are not archaeologically PhDs, which is most of my audience, including me, I would love to find out where did your aha moment come? Were you investigating ancient sites, or were you looking at pole shifts? How did this book come about?
Well, it's not what you think. I was actually going on vacation. We were going to the Yucatan, and I was looking at some of the sites I wanted to visit using Google Earth, and I'm looking at these sites, and I realized they're not aligned north, south, east, and west to the cardinal directions. They're all most of them were rotated in different directions. And what happened was I had a flashback. I kind of see my life as really being a series of several lives. And in a past life, I kind of got started. My departure from the scientific mainstream took place in the 80s when I began to investigate a collection of unusual surface features on Mars. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the face on Mars and the pyramids in Cydonia and so forth. And
right.
I wrote a paper. Yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I wrote a paper on my work. Was published in a journal in the 80s, and that led to some scientific validation and interest. But for the most part, the mainstream still believes that these features are natural geological formations, and we can talk about that at some point. But part of what I looked at back then. We have someone that's being really persistent here. I think we're just going to have to let this ring.
Okay.
What I started looking at then were alignments between different structures. And it turned out that these structures on Mars were also not aligned cardinally to the north, south, east, and west, but were rotated. And one of my colleagues at the time, Richard Hoagland, who wrote a book called Monuments of Mars, believed that these structures were aligned to the summer solstice sunrise on Mars about 500,000 years ago. And based on this alignment, he was able, he proposed a dating of about 500,000 years old. Another scientist at the time had a different take on it. His name was Thomas Van Flandern. He passed away a few years ago. His perspective, he saw a different possibility, and that was that these structures were once aligned to the North Pole when Mars's pole was in a different location. And this is actually accepted that prior to the formation of what's called the Tharsis Bulge, which is an enormous volcano on Mars, Mars's North Pole was in a different position. And when it was in that different position, Cydonia, the city in the face, so-called city in the face, were located close to the Martian equator and were oriented in the cardinal directions. So, back in the 80s, 90s, I was looking at pole shifts, but they were on Mars. And, it'd been years since I'd done that work. I'd kind of forgotten about it, moved on to other things. And then, a few years ago, I'm looking at these structures in the Yucatan and thinking, wait a second, I remember this idea, and then it got me to thinking, and it's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I guess we have time, right? We've got a little bit of time here.
Oh yeah.
What I remembered was that back a few years prior, actually more than that, in the 90s, I believe it was, a Canadian author Rand Flem Abt and his wife that proposed that Atlantis was once that Atlantis actually is the landmass that's now the South Pole. That prior to a pole shift, the South Pole, Antarctica, had been at a higher latitude and had a temperate climate, and that was prior to the pole shift Atlantis. And what he also talks about in that is how certain features on the Earth's surface would have changed position as well. And he talks about Teotihuacan having been at a different latitude and being oriented close to the cardinal directions, but he didn't go to that. He didn't make that leap that perhaps it was once oriented exactly to the cardinal directions. And the reason for that was that he used a location that Charles Hapgood had proposed for a prior location of the pole, and that's probably that's I don't want to get too far into that, but kind of all these answers are somewhat connected. But anyway, all these wheels started turning, and my aha moment occurred when I started looking at structures in other parts of Mexico and other parts of the world, and beginning to see that they could actually point to a few locations, not where the current pole is now, but away from it, similar to what the Flem Abt had found out, but other locations. And I thought perhaps what we're looking at are sites that were once aligned to a series of prior North Poles. So that was my aha moment, and it actually didn't that long to unfold, but it took quite a while to work it out and to figure it out and to document all these sites and describe them, which is in the book. Anyway, so I'll stop there and let you talk.
Well, I think that you've really kind of brought up something that most people are going to go, what?
Yeah.
Because the fact that the crust of the Earth does move, and the over hundreds of thousands of years, our North Pole has been in lots of different places, which explains a lot of things about ice ages and things like that. So that knowing that the crust, and it doesn't do it overnight. Although I think there have been times when it almost was like overnight, but because the crust shifts, the pole shifts, and with that, the tilt of the Earth shifts, so that this planet isn't just going around in circles. It's wobbling, I guess is the best way to put it, over hundreds of thousands of years. It's wobbled quite a bit. And so to equate, the positions of these sacred sites to, different times where the poles were in different places does give you an understanding as to how very old many of these sites actually are. Not just scientists, archaeologists seem to be stuck in just the last 10 or 12,000 years, and they don't think anything happened beyond that, I guess.
Right.
Because most of the structures are dated to the younger Dryas stage, and they just don't go back beyond the 10, 17,000 years, whatever it is. So your plotting of the sacred sites takes things to a much older time frame. So
that's
how much?
Yeah.
I just want people to understand. Actually, between the pole shifts, how many years are there? between the pole shifts to give people an understanding as to the great length of time between these different pole shifts.
Right. So let me just start by saying, yeah, you're exactly right. And what this research attempts to do is go back even further. It used to be thought that that our technological civilization originated with the early Egyptian, the dynastic period, let's say in Egypt, or the Sumerians. These would be the earliest civilizations, and then they started finding more civilizations, in Central Asia, in Indus Valley, and other parts of the world. And then there was Göbekli Tepe, which was thousands of years before that, and so now the thought is, yeah, our modern society, technological society, began around 10,000 BC, roughly, and around the same time wheat was domesticated, and all sorts of other developments occurred. Just amazingly all at the same time. And that's kind of where archaeologists are now. What the pole shift hypothesis proposes is that this is just the latest era, the latest age, and but it's not the only one. It's not the only technological civilization that developed on the planet. That there were prior ones, and these occurred during earlier times when the poles were in different locations. And the reason we don't know about these civilizations is that they were destroyed. When the pole shifts occurred, there were cataclysms, there were floods, earthquakes, upheavals, lands rising and sinking, and societies were destroyed. They were decimated. Not totally, because we have some record of these past civilizations, these past cultures through the oral tradition, through myth and legend, but hard evidence records for the most part don't exist. No, not a lot in the way of material culture, other than these megalithic structures we find throughout the world. And it's these megalithic structures, by virtue of their alignment to prior poles, these earlier poles, suggest that there were two things. It suggests that there were these pole shifts, and that these pole shifts could have been the source of the destruction, that is recorded in, say, Plato's myth of Atlantis, and other myths, stories, myth legends in other parts of the world. And also provides, and this is the cool thing, it provides a way of actually dating these structures. So it's not just like a woohoo theory without any numbers on it. Because my background's in engineering and science, and I don't want to be able to. I want to be able to justify a hypothesis as quantitatively as using facts as much as possible. And so clearly, if these pole shifts occurred, when did they occur? Where were these poles? And these are things that I want to be very specific about, which I am in the book. And so to answer your question, these pole shifts have occurred roughly. I mean, it's not like a precessional cycle that it occurs every 25,000 years. But let me just take out my book that has the tables here, so I'll give you the exact timing. That the earliest pole shift that I examined in the book occurred about 130,000 years ago. Following that was the pole shift of approximately 83,000 years ago, then 63,000 years ago, and then around 16,000 years ago. So this last pole shift around 16,000, actually it was 16,000 BCE, so around 18,000 years ago, would have been the one that Plato wrote about in the myth of Atlantis. So, what I'm interested in is not just that pole shift and not the state of the world at that point in time, but what happened before that. And so that's, hence the title of the book, Before Atlantis. It's really looking back in time well beyond that. So it's kind of like I've taken two jumps. If archaeologists are now back 10,000 years, and those that are, looking at the Younger Dryas event and, how perhaps the floods and cataclysms and origins, say, of our technological civilization might be correlated with that. I'm actually looking before that, and then even further before that to even prior ages. And these ages are actually captured in myths and legends of other cultures throughout the world. And so there's a connection between myth and legend and science. And, I believe it's telling you the same story, but they're like different pieces of information coming from different places.
Yeah, it was fascinating for me because and I have no scientific background to call on, just a gut, and I've always felt that beyond that the Younger Dryas time frame, prior to that, there had to be other cultures. There had to be. I mean, you can't just this planet hasn't just sat here for millions of years. There had to have been forms of civilization that we just don't have a record of, or people we don't have a record of. And it to me, it's almost felt as though we're very much like primitive men in many ways, in that when we don't understand something, we make up a story to make it seem real or unreal, whichever you want to call it. But that there are things that have followed through time. The element Plato and his talk of Atlantis, no, it's lasted for too long. It's hung on for too long. There's got to be fact in there someplace. It isn't just a good story that's told around the campsite for millions or thousands of years. There has to be something more to it. Or
right.
we would have let go of it.
That's right. And if you dissect it, there's a lot to it. And people have done that. And mostly what they've done is they've dissected the part of the story having to do with the actual place Atlantis. This place, the city with the concentric circles, the concentric, islands, and just sort of what it looked like and what the people were like, and even clues about, where it was located, starting from beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Mm-hmm. And people have interpreted that in so many different ways. What the story also talks about, though, the Egyptian priest talking to Solon, to the Greek, telling them, that the Athenians were once, first in battle, first in war. They were these great heroes. And the Egyptian priest is talking about them in the past tense, before the Egyptian civilization, before the current the civilization that was in existence at that time in Egypt, which the Greeks regarded as an advanced civilization. I mean, the Greeks got, let's face it, they got most of what they knew from other cultures, from other civilizations.
Right.
They co-opted a lot of the knowledge that that Westerners attribute to the Greeks, but it really came from an earlier sources. And so what the Egyptian priest is talking about is a state of an advanced culture that existed in Europe prior to the Athenians, to the Greeks at the time, that predated the Minoans and all these other civilizations, far more ancient civilization. So as I started looking at the evidence, and looking at, and there's a couple of different threads here. One is, when you put the poles in different locations, and let me just do this for a moment. Let me just digress and say, the pole now being at the North Pole is why, north is north. Prior to the North Pole being in the Arctic, it was evidence suggests that it was located east of Hudson Bay in Canada. When you put the pole at that location, that's the top. That's the top of the Earth. That's the point that we're spinning around. And at that location, now where I live in New England, was shifted quite a bit north, so far north it was above the Arctic Circle, and and it's well known that this giant ice sheet covered North America for tens of thousands of years. Climatologists believe, mainstream scientists believe that this was caused by cycles of warming and cooling on the planet. But according to Charles Hapgood, he proposed the idea that the ice ages were the result of pole shifts, that the ice age in North America occurred because North America was at the pole. And prior to that, there was an ice age in Europe, and that was because Europe, actually it wasn't Europe so much, but a point in the Norwegian Sea was at the top of the Earth, at the North Pole. And so by these shifts occurring, it changes climate, not by changing the amount of sunlight or anything having to do with the atmosphere, but simply where on the planet the crust has been shifted and the different land masses are located. And so when the North Pole was in Hudson Bay, North America was under this tremendous ice sheet, but Europe had a very temperate climate, and it would have been certainly conducive for a civilization to have developed and existed, flourished there, in fact. And you can make similar climate predictions for what was going on in other parts of the world. For example, in Mesoamerica, in Central America and Mexico, like today we're finding all of these buried structures hidden by the jungle. They're using advanced technology called LIDAR to look through the foliage, and they're finding these vast Mesoamerican cities that are thousands of years old. Well, it's if you've been down there, it's a harsh environment. It's hot. It's humid. How could they have existed and built such a thriving civilization under such conditions? Well, if the pole were in Hudson Bay, Mesoamerica would have been shifted further north, and it would have had a temperate climate. It would have been much more like North America than the climate it has today. And so, in using now this as a context, you can see how certain civilizations may have developed, and then when the pole shifted, why they were destroyed and never recovered. There's evidence of advanced civilizations in Central Asia, the Gobi Desert and other the deserts in the stands, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, places like that. You can hardly survive in those places today. How could an advanced civilization have existed there? Well, it could have if the climate conditions were different, which they would have been when the pole was in a different location. And so that's the Hapgood hypothesis with regard to pole shifts in climate, and that obviously has to be consistent with where civilizations developed and flourished and where they didn't. Because if an area would have been too hot or too cold, and it appears that there was a civilization there, well, something's wrong, something's not making sense. But if you actually go through the analysis, and I do much of this in the book, and there's more coming, it makes a lot of sense. So not only do the sites line up to these pole locations, but if you look at the climate conditions at the time, it would have been conducive for a civilization to have existed in that part of the world. So there's a consistency there that suggests, it may be on the right track with this hypothesis.
Now you've taken it back 130,000 years, which is a lot, but the planet's millions of years old. So,
right.
I'm just wondering, is the location of the pole limited to certain areas, like at the top of the world? Or, well, it would be the top of the world no matter where the pole was. I mean, is there a possibility that I don't know, some place like Cuba could have been the North Pole? Or is there an axis that this pole shift stays within?
this idea of pole shifts within the last 100,000 years is not considered. Most Earth scientists would reject this idea. They would say there's no evidence for it. What they will concede, however, is that there's evidence that 500 million years ago, around the time of it was the time of the Cambrian explosion. This was a time when just about all the species that exist on Earth today were first appeared somehow, magically. At that time, there was a pole shift, a 90-degree pole shift. So what was at the equator shifted to the pole and vice versa. So it was like, taking your globe and rotating it, 90 degrees. And there is evidence to support that. The evidence comes from rocks. So let me just sort of back up a little bit. It's pretty widely accepted that the Earth, the Earth's crust is broken up into plates. The original theory was called Continental Drift that Wegener proposed back in the early part of the 1900s. It took some time, though, for it to be proven because, it's operating at over such long time scales, you can't really observe it. But by digging up rocks and measuring, from their location and how they were dug up and, their position and all this, and then measuring their magnetic field, it was able to determine, this happened in the 60s, because the scientific equipment got to the state that they could do this analysis. They determined that the crust that these plates were actually moving at different rates. And based on that, it became evident that, that plate motion, tectonic motion is a reality, and it's an important dynamic process on the planet. Everyone goes along with that idea now. There were those, though, that also proposed the idea that what was needed was another movement that would allow certain imbalances that might build up on the surface to correct, for those imbalances to correct itself. Because the crust of the Earth is not firmly attached to the core, it kind of floats over the mantle, which is like a plastic, sort of a semi-liquid consistency. The thought was that if the buildup is sufficient, then it could cause the whole crust and all these plates tied to, that are sort of moving with respect to one another, this whole mass of plates that cause the whole thing to shift over the mantle. And that was the idea that Hapgood was proposing. But the problem with trying to prove the hypothesis that there's been pole shifts more recently is that the accuracy or the resolution of this magnetic data, of the analysis that the Earth scientists did to prove plate tectonics, isn't good enough. They can only measure things that, accurate or with a resolution of about 500,000 years. So things that are moving over time periods of millions of years, we can track that really well. But anything moving that's changing over time periods of tens of thousands of years, you can't do it. It's like trying to resolve. You've gone on Google Earth or Google Maps and you get a satellite image, and it'd be like trying to read someone's license plate. You can't do it. You don't have the resolution there, and so there's really a lack of evidence because it's the methods that don't seem, at least in that particular area, sufficient to determine if there could have been more recent crustal displacements, more recent pole shifts. But there might be other ways of dating things. So
it's interesting because for the last since Younger Dryas, we've got a pretty good handle on theoretically what has happened on the surface here. But prior to that, we're almost in the Dark Ages, and going back that far, and I love the fact that you took all four of these pole shifts and you took structures that were at that time frame aligned with north, and you put all of antiquity into these four different categories, time frames, and it gives you a better idea as to the age. And it also, I had an ancestor who he was commissioned to find the North Pole, and if he'd known any of this stuff, wouldn't have helped him any, but he may have wandered over the North Pole at one time, but from a different time zone. It's kind of like an area code. He didn't quite make it, but it's you look at the age, and it's so impressive, and especially in the ones in Mesoamerica, they are so intricate, and they almost every culture that I have read about, that I have heard about, no matter how primitive the time frames seem to be, they seem to have an astrological understanding of the stars and of the pole star, and whether it was wherever it is now, or it was Thuma, or wherever, there was some understanding as to orientation, and they built according to that. The
idea of using the heavens, that seems to be universal, as above, so below. Right.
So that all of these, they knew where north was, and
right.
How did they align to? Yeah, this is where the pole is, and how did they didn't have compasses, well, at least early. So were they using the stars? How were they determining north?
Well, you can determine north by, in a single day. The north-south line is the point where the sun reaches the highest point in the sky. Right. So regardless of season, if you can find that direction in the northern hemisphere, that's due south, and that sets up a line. You can do it based on sunrise. Moving from the point furthest north of east on the first day of summer to left south of east. I'm sorry, furthest east of north. Furthest north of east. That's right. So
Okay.
I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me reset.
Okay.
So on the first day of spring, the sun rises and sets due east, due west, right? And that's the equinox. So that's actually the point the day I was going for. So when east and west, then north and south is at a right angle to that.
Right.
And people have looked at the Egyptian ancient technology that Egyptians used for measuring things, and there's books written on how they could have estimated directions and in particular north by observing the sun and so forth. But that's interpreting things in terms of that level of technology. We don't really know what might have existed prior to that. It is kind of a mystery. But sort of what has inspired me, besides, part of what I do is try to follow, obviously as a scientist, you want to follow the data, follow the facts, see where they lead. And so you have to have, specific models and hypotheses. And, numbers and ideas, and and there's a lot of those in the book. There's a lot of very definite maps showing orientations and how these things line up. But in addition to that, there's also sort of the there's like an underlying drive or motivation. Maybe call it a worldview. I've always been influenced by Eastern traditions that suggest that we're a lot older than what's implied in the Bible. Let's say. There's many interpretations of what's in the Bible, but some have interpreted the Bible as saying that Earth was created on a specific date. I forget exactly the date, but that's one interpretation. But Eastern philosophy sees the cosmos as these cycles of just vast time periods of thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions and billions of years, and this sense that our culture, that humanity is older than just pre-dynastic Egypt or Sumeria, or even even Göbekli Tepe now, sort of the earliest horizon. That it's even older than that sort of has motivated me to see, is there a way of filling in that gap? If we only go back 10,000 years, and there's a sense that humanity might have been around millions of years, tens of millions of years ago. Is there any evidence that can sort of fill in that gap of speculation? Because let's face it really is speculation. There's really no compelling physical evidence. It's open to question. They find things, anomalies out of place. They found objects that, like metal spheres at great depths. They recovered from mines in South Africa. And it's like, how did something like that get there? So there's this scattered evidence, but it's more anecdotal. And so my thought was that if I could find more geometrical evidence that existed in the form of these ancient structures, this might be a way of filling in the gap using a different kind of information that no one had really thought about doing. And so this is sort of where I am a couple years into this. I found several hundred sites throughout the world that appear to be either directly aligned to or in some way reference these prior pole locations. And it actually explains a lot of the unexplained sites. It explains why the Acropolis is misaligned the way it is, why the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek is misaligned the way it is. And by the way, archaeologists don't have good explanations for why some of these buildings are aligned as they are. And the majority of sites in Mesoamerica, or let me put it this way, the minority of sites in Mesoamerica are aligned to north. Most are aligned in other directions. Why is that? Why would that be? And archaeologists really, it's amazing to watch the mental gymnastics that they go through to try to explain some of this stuff. And it just seems to me that, it's like everything else. Oftentimes the simplest explanation is the correct explanation. And so pole shifts provide a very simple explanation to explain a really complex phenomenon that, all of these sites are aligned in all these strange ways. When you look at these poles and you start drawing lines from the poles, in effect meridian lines from these prior poles to these sites, they line right up to them. So is it coincidence? It's possible, but there's just hundreds of over 200 sites at this point that either directly are aligned to these poles or are aligned in directions of solstices or lunar standstills. These are also significant alignments that we found, but not reference to the current pole, but reference to these prior poles. And that gets a little difficult to understand, but I do have examples in the book that show that and how that works.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what gets to me is, archaeologists are it's an amazing field, and yet they are very reluctant to step out of the norm for fear they will lose their career, by taking
right.
it to extreme, going to extremes, so that there's a lot of restraint as to, until you can, hit me in the face with so many facts, I can't deny it. I'm going to hold to the old, and in a way, maybe that's good, and in a way, it's not good. But it seems to be the way it is, so there's no arguing with it. But your alignment of the different sites was fascinating to me, because it finally made sense that if they had the current history has tried to cram the creation of all of this into a very short period of time, and
right.
the records of where humanity was at that particular point in time don't coincide with the age of the structure. They just don't.
Exactly.
And yet
exactly.
we're supposed to accept the fact. We know. With Egyptian stuff, we have records of those time frames, and yet the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza and the Sphinx, it just doesn't compute, and any intelligent person looking at it would say that just doesn't make sense. Look at the tools they had available to them. This cannot possibly be the right. It has to be older. And if it's older, then
yeah.
what? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Egypt. That was a copper or maybe Bronze Age culture, right? And they're cutting, transporting, hoisting, positioning stones that weigh many tons. And what's just unbelievable is that they've done experiments. You've seen this on numerous television shows, right? Where they don't even try to do a one scale. It's like, okay, let's do like 1/10 of a scale and see if we can figure out how they did this, or raising an obelisk. They just can't do it. It's not possible. Even with modern technology. I mean, there are cranes that they say, like the stones that in Peru's Sacred Valley at some of these sites, Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, are so large that, I mean, the largest cranes couldn't hoist them. I mean, how could you possibly do it, particularly in that terrain? And so, I mean, so there's some interesting ideas. People are talking about things like geopolymers. So, some of these stones were maybe not cut, but they were cast. And that's the explanation now of a lot of people favor for the so-called H blocks at Tiwanaku. And there's actually some theories for the pyramids being also constructed from geopolymer blocks. So what's interesting is there's now technologies that are available for dating things. It used to be carbon 14 dating, radiocarbon dating was all you could do. So you couldn't really date the stone. All you could do is date the artifacts. Like if this charcoal packs around from a fire, you could, right, based on circumstantial, co-located evidence. It's like, okay, this was built at the same time, but that's always an assumption, right? That's not direct evidence. Now they have a technique. It's called luminescence dating, optically stimulated luminescence dating, OSL. And what they can do is actually they can take a rock that's been hidden by the sun from the outside. So you dig up a rock and you do it carefully, and then you expose it, you let it become exposed to light, and it luminesces. And based on the period of time and the intensity, they can determine how long the rock was actually underground. And so you can use that as a method to saying, in theory, when was this foundation first built? These stones first put into place. And so I think there's hope of dating some of these ancient structures. It's going to be extremely difficult because the hypothesis in Before Atlantis is not that say what you see at Chichen Itza now when you go there is 80,000 years old or 60,000 years old in that time frame, but that the first structure there, that the original foundation on which that was built, or even one prior to that, I mean, because what you find in Mesoamerica are structures built on top of earlier structures and around earlier structures. And so what you're asking, the ultimate question is, when was that first foundation built? So in principle, there's a way of dating it, but it's going to be really difficult to get underneath it to get those samples. But I don't know, if there's a will, there's a way. There may not be a way. There may not be a will to do it because, of course, a lot of these sites are controlled by governments, and they have archaeologists, and they're sticking to the gospel that the Aztecs or the Toltecs, let's say, were the first people, and they date back to just prior to the historical period. The idea of 5 ages. The Aztecs have this myth of the 5 suns, which were, I talk about that in the book, and how the pole shifts line up to those ages. The idea of going back, tens of thousands of years would not be something that they would want to explore. Talking about earlier about academics being afraid of losing their funding and their credibility and so forth.
Well, it's publish or perish in many cases too, but
right.
I think what got me so excited about your book was it did, you look at things like I now yell at the TV a lot when I see ancient stuff on like the Great Pyramid of Giza, and they tell you how Khufu created it, and no, he didn't. I get very frustrated to the point where I turn them off sometimes, because it was common knowledge whenever these programs were made, that was the accepted whatever. But in the 10 years since they were created, so much has been discovered and so much is out there that says no. And no, there weren't bodies in these pyramids. They were for something else. And I've talked to a number of people that have theories that are just so profoundly amazing. That to me are more rational than what the history books are talking. I don't know if it's right or not, but I certainly am fascinated by the possibilities, and I think there's a sadness in that people aren't open to a possibility that there's greater age here, because that speaks to the fact that our culture, our species is so much older than we've been, led to believe. I mean, we certainly, they have human remains that go back hundreds of thousands of years. So, it doesn't take that long to develop. I mean, I go along with you on the fact that, there are time frames when there are major disasters, when we're shoved back to the Stone Age and we have to develop yet again. But there have been cultures on this planet, in my opinion, we're far more technologically advanced than we are today. And they've left records.
Yeah.
They've left hints. They've left breadcrumbs, and you're following the breadcrumbs, and I think it's great.
Yeah, and I think it's also possible that, and some of the reluctance might be because these earlier civilizations predate Homo sapiens sapien. These earlier cultures could go back to the time of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And this is what this is literally just a breadcrumb. It's a paragraph in the book, because I'm not, I try to stick to what I know, and people that read about this stuff are pretty smart, and I have footnotes and references to so they can find out more. But the theory now is that there were these other predated Homo sapiens sapien, modern man,
Mm-hmm.
Cro-Magnon man, and the possibility exists that these they were around for 500,000 years. If we developed a material culture in a few thousand, say in 10,000 years, let's say, why couldn't they have done it before? And so, and the evidence suggests that they had larger brains. There's evidence of advanced technology, being able to. I'm thinking in terms of the bracelets found up in Siberia, in the Denisova cave, showing
Mm-hmm.
advanced knowledge of not metalwork, but being able to drill very fine, tiny holes and things and so forth. So not megalithic construction, but very fine scale detail. So there was tens of thousands of years ago, this technology existed. It wasn't Homo sapiens sapien, it was something else. So the possibility exists that it could have been a previous subspecies. It didn't have to be an ancient alien. It could have been, an indigenous, prior version of man, which, some of the ancient texts talk about, that we're just the latest, we're not the only ones. So
Yeah.
I think this is a possibility.
Well, and I think you draw a very good comparison to the fact that our stories of the gods could easily have been a culture that was left over from a previous dynasty on the planet that maybe wasn't there possibly weren't thousands of them, but maybe hundreds, and that they became the material from which we developed our gods. So that,
right.
And I've often thought in ancient Egypt, especially in ancient Egypt, a lot of those huge statues. I kind of think that they might well have been life size, and
literally true. Yeah.
So that would explain. I mean, I think that our history is such an amazing story that historians have dumbed it down to the point where nobody even cares about it anymore. But I mean, just sticking to us. I mean, there are massive graveyards of little people and giants together that have been discovered and covered up, of course. But
right.
But there's historical records of it. So just because we don't have historical records doesn't mean that there weren't people who weren't exactly like us, but who we are related to in one way or another. And it makes great sense that survivors of a mass destruction area made it through whatever disastrous time it was, and were scattered all over the planet, and that's where a lot of the knowledge and wisdom for these massive structures came from. And then once they died out, the structures remained as a testimony to their existence, and other humans came in and said, "Oh, this is cool, let's just build a town around this," and that's how that happened. I mean,
right.
Why couldn't that have happened?
I mean, the Christians co-opted the pagan temples in the Roman temples, the pagan temples, and they built over them, and churches build over mosques, and it happens all the time. And this idea of building over a pre-existing structure is kind of a key idea in Before Atlantis, because again, it would be a hard sell to claim that these structures we see today are tens of thousands of years old. But similarly, it would be like you go to Rome today, and there's modern structures built in and integrated into the ruins. It's all kind of seamless. They all kind of conform to the same ground plan, and that ground plan was established thousands of years ago. There are parts of Rome that are aligned to lunar standstills. Like who would even know of that or care about it today? But back thousands of years ago, when societies, cultures were strongly influenced by the heavens, aligning things to events like the motions of the moon and the sun, the solstices were really important. So, it's kind of like a fingerprint, a signature that kind of carries over, and I think that's what we're seeing. You were talking about science. Why is it the way it is? It's when you look at what science does, science kind of builds a box around an area, sort of like a conceptual box, right? And they say, okay, we're going to try to figure out what's in that box. And, it's a divide and conquer strategy. It's reductionism. They take something that's complex and they break it up into pieces, and that's how they try to understand it. I mean, and that works for a lot of things. It works for natural processes, for probably geology and things like that, and climate. It works in physics for sure. But it probably doesn't work really well in like the life sciences, because you break everything down. You break the human being down into organs, cells, molecules, atoms, and what do you have? You have matter, and we're clearly more than matter. So, I mean, but in a sense, you don't fault science, because it's kind of what they do. They create these boxes, and then they figure out what's inside the boxes, and then human beings with being who we are, then we quote unquote own that, right? We own that paradigm, that theory, and it becomes personal. If you disagree with the theory, it's like you're attacking me, right? And so there's a lot of that in science. I mean, so much in it's like in academia, though. I think the biggest egos are in academia. I don't think it's in the entertainment industry. I think academia is probably the worst. And so, I think that's part of it too. And what's great about what we're doing, and we being people that are, I'm not doing this for a living. It's my daughter calls it my side hustle. People, some people, sort of like would say, oh, this is my hobby. I like to build, planes too, but it's sort of not exactly. We'll call it a hobby. I think a side hustle is as good a term as any. But I think what we're doing, you and I and all of us that are sort of involved in these types of efforts is sort of pushing science out, pushing that box, pushing the sides of that box, opening it up, kicking the walls down, and letting more things in. And they're fighting tooth and nail. They don't want that. But I think some of the stuff will stick. And then then of course they'll say, well, we knew that all along, right? But that's fine. I mean, who cares? The important thing is that you get progress.
Well, I think a long while back, I interviewed somebody that did a book on forbidden archaeology, and it was a laborious book to get through, and that it was all on flintstones, and how once they discover flintstones, they say this is the most primitive, this is as old as it gets, it doesn't get any older than this, and they stopped digging. And, beneath those layers was even more primitive stuff from other cultures, from other time frames. And I think that so often there's an arrogance about man and woman, I mean mankind, let's put it that way. There's an arrogance that we are the superior race. Maybe not. Maybe the superior race has been here and gone. But there's an arrogance that we are the most developed. We are, everything else is primitive. And the reality is that there were, I truly believe, really advanced civilizations here before we were hunter-gathering. And to not acknowledge that, some of the stuff that we've got today came from our interaction with that race is foolish. Come on. It just you look at some of the structures out there. I can't remember because I didn't write it down in my notes. Which time frame was the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid erected on? So how old would you say they were?
Yeah. Okay. So this is mind blowing because everyone thinks like this is like the oldest thing on the planet, right? And it's the most sophisticated. Well, it's extremely sophisticated and it's fairly well preserved, largely by virtue of its size. But the pyramid is aligned very precisely to the cardinal directions. So it was built after the pole shift.
Okay.
So what my conjecture is that those who had the knowledge, the builders from the previous age, those that survived and carried that knowledge forward, those are the builders of the pyramids. These are the followers of Horus. That predated the dynastic period in Egypt, for example. And I think similar, probably come up with similar time frames. And there's the Sumerian kings list, and there are rulers before Kish, which the first pre-dynastic or the first king after the flood. There's a whole bunch of antediluvian kings. And so, I think you're looking at, in those time frames, and those people, those civilizations were the ones that had that knowledge and they brought it forward. But, again, after, post flood would be anything after the flood would be aligned to, based on the geometry of pole shifts, would be aligned to the current pole, and the pole doesn't move very much. It moves a little bit, and in fact the pyramid the pyramids are not aligned. Khufu is not exactly aligned north, south, east, and west. It's off by a fraction of a minute in terms of angle, and that could be due to a shift or a slight drift in the pole since the time it was built. So in other words, it could have been built exactly facing the North Pole at the time, but over the last however many tens of thousands of years, let's say 10,000 years or so, it's the pole shifted a little bit, and so it's off a little bit.
Does the Sphinx fall into that same? Does the Sphinx fall into that same time frame?
Yeah, it would, because its reference is it's looking. It looks east, right? I believe it looks due east, and the idea is that, according to Bobal and Hancock, that the Sphinx and pyramids were a reflection of the heavens, circa, the age of Leo, 10,500 BC.
Okay.
So yeah, that's all consistent. So the really old stuff is not, and I actually talk about this a little bit in the book. The really old stuff is not in Lower Egypt, but I believe is in Upper Egypt. These are the temples along the Nile, Luxor, Abydos, other places that have numerous structures. In fact, most structures there are not aligned to the cardinal directions. They're aligned. Karnak is actually aligned to the solstice, but there are other temples that don't seem to have any obvious alignment to any astronomically significant directions. And this has really kind of had a lot of archaeologists scratching their heads. There's a bunch of papers written about this, and some believe that the temples were aligned to the Nile River. In other words, as the Nile winds its course through Upper Egypt, these temples were aligned to sort of face the Nile. And there's other hypotheses, but I've also shown that a fair number of these reference previous locations of the pole. And it's my conjecture, my hypothesis is that this was the part of Egypt that actually survived the cataclysm after the last pole shift. In other words, where the floods inundated the Mediterranean, Greece, and Lower Egypt, the New World, Mesoamerica, other parts of the world, because Upper Egypt is away from the ocean. It's at a higher altitude. It's actually far from any earthquake faults, that it would have been relatively protected from any cataclysm. And so what had existed, Egyptian civilization that existed before the pole shift, was that which was in Upper Egypt, whereas everything pretty much in Lower Egypt is aligned to the cardinal directions. And I believe, and there's analysis of this both in the book and on beforeatlantis.com. There's a lot of papers, a lot of information there showing that a lot of structures closer to the Mediterranean, that is Lower Egypt, are aligned to the cardinal directions, indicating they were built after the last pole shift.
Very cool.
That was a lot. That was a lot to get through. Let me just mention. beforeatlantis.com is the website, and it's sort of a blog. I don't blog every day. I'll post an article every some months 2 or 3, but it's been a few months since I've done the last one. But there's about 24 articles there that go into more detail on these sites, and there's a few related to Plato's Atlantis and Egypt and the distribution of sites. And there's actually some papers, some working papers that I've published that you can also get access to that have more tables and graphs and figures. You can get into more detail. It's all available online. It's all free. It's all there.
Well, where are the structures of the greatest antiquity on the planet so far?
So based on alignment, they would appear to be in Peru, in the Sacred Valley, places like Cusco, Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu. These are sites that are aligned to the oldest pole location. Hapgood put the oldest pole in his original theory in the Yukon. So again, just to back up a little bit, the current pole is in the Arctic. The previous pole, which places like Teotihuacan in Mexico City would be aligned to, is the Hudson Bay pole. That's east of Hudson Bay in Canada. Prior to that, there was a pole that's been determined to have been located in the Norwegian Sea, which would have been a time when Europe experienced an ice age. Prior to that, the pole would have been in northern Greenland, and prior to that, in the Aleutian Islands. In the Bering Sea, north of the Aleutian Islands.
And that's about 130,000. Yeah, that's about 130,000 years ago.
That's right. And so, these sites in the Sacred Valley are aligned. They're all aligned in that direction. It's actually quite remarkable. But they're not the only ones. You find this. This is the whole idea that I kind of want to get to is that on triangulation. You can have a lot of things in the same area pointing in the same direction. That kind of gives you a line, but a pole location is a point. So you need like things in along some other meridian in order to sort of intersect those lines and say, yeah, the pole was here. And it turns out that there are sites in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East that point in the same general direction. And so, like a place like, turns out the Bosnian Pyramid of the Sun is aligned in this direction as well, as is the Temple of the Winged Lions at Petra. And there's about a half a dozen other sites, and these would be the oldest sites based on this hypothesis. So the best known sites, I think, those in the Peruvian mountains, the Sacred Valley would be the oldest.
I'm just trying to. It would seem, according to the different pole shifts, that area basically has stayed free of ice, if you will, for the longest period of time.
Right.
So that would make great sense. That would be where what you would call civilization would have possibly survived shifts and cataclysms and all sorts of things.
Yeah,
so
someone just wrote me that's right. Someone just wrote me the other day and said, I'm trying to understand your theory, and it's like I'm trying to understand why there aren't any ancient sites in North America. Is it because of this theory? I said, yes, exactly. It's because, if the last pole shift put the North Pole in Hudson Bay, then all of North America, pretty much, except for the southern part of the U.S., would have been in the Arctic, the then Arctic Circle would have been under a sheet of ice. That would have destroyed anything that existed prior to that. I mean, you're under 3 miles of ice. You're pretty much going to be anything. Pretty much would be wiped out. I mean, we haven't found anything yet. There are artifacts that are that have been found in other places in the southern U.S., in California, even down in Texas. There's some interesting sites that could be that old. But I mean, in terms of why aren't there megalithic sites in North America? For exactly the reason you're alluding to, Barbara, is because they would have been destroyed because they were under a glacier. They were at the pole or close to the pole in a polar region, whereas places closer to the equator were never, at least over the last 100,000 years, were never at a pole. But a place like the Gobi Desert or Central Asia, which is now totally inhospitable. When the pole was located in Hudson Bay, the climate was completely different there. And in fact, there were glaciers in the mountains. I forgot the name of them to the south. Between Pakistan and Iran. There's pretty good evidence that there was a large inland sea that existed in that part of the world. So the climate was completely different. So I think what you're finding are the oldest civilizations will be away from the poles. So you also don't find anything like in Northern Europe. The most sophisticated structures you find are these polygonal blocked megalithic structures in Italy and in Greece, like at the Temple of Apollo.
But they're within the last 10,000 years. I mean, they're babies. They're babies. They're young. What would help?
Let me just say, so the Temple of the Temple of Apollo is that you're right. That's considered to be fairly recent. However, the alignment of the Temple of Apollo faces the Hudson Bay Pole, which suggests that it was built before the flood. And so, now I'm not saying the temple itself. There's actually a polygonal, and this in the book. There's a polygonal wall below it that is not aligned in the same direction as the temple itself. This is at Delphi. I'm talking about the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. the polygonal wall below it is made of these enormous Cyclopean boulders, these blocks, not boulders, they're cut stone, and they fit together in very intricate patterns. And so the hypothesis based on their alignment is that they predate the last pole shift. So they were built more than 18,000 years ago. So they're not babies. They're actually, the Greeks built on top of them, but they built on top of something that was pre-existing.
Okay.
And there's other examples in Greece and in Italy, but you don't find much north of that. You don't find much north of Mexico, of say Mexico City, north of Teotihuacan, north of the Yucatan. There's not much in the central U.S. And it's for that reason that they were too close to a prior pole. Anything would have been destroyed. The conditions, the climate conditions would have been too cold.
What about? I mean, I know we don't have records, but I mean, come on, Russia and China are right up there too. They should have been under sheets of ice as well.
That's right. But and this is an interesting. What is interesting is that there are in northern Russia, and the specific location escapes me, but when the North Pole if the North Pole were in the Norwegian Sea, kind of north, but relative to Siberia, it's far away. So when if the North Pole were in the Norwegian Sea, Siberia would have been at a much lower latitude. It's kind of hard to envision this. If you have a globe, you can certainly do this by moving the globe around. And the graphics in the book try to accomplish this as well. But so when the North Pole was in the Norwegian Sea, then Siberia, in fact, the region around where the Denisovin cave is found, was at a much more temperate latitude. Right now, it's pretty far north. There's actually a site nearby called Porbajan. I'm sure that's not the correct pronunciation, but it appears to reference the Norwegian Sea Pole. It's not lined, it's the cardinal directions as they exist today. So yes, there are a few sites up north, but they were not. These sites were not north when the pole was in a different location. In particular, these ones in northern Russia. This one site was at a lower latitude when the pole was in Hudson Bay, but I mean, we may still find sites up north. It just seems that the biggest, the megalithic sites, the greatest concentration is temperate zone into the equatorial zones right now. We haven't found very much that's up north, too close to the poles.
Well, yeah, it would be. I would love to see because when there is that ice cover, when there is that ice age, that means that most of the water is is ice, and therefore the landmass is different and greater. The continents, the water from the oceans, is in ice, and so therefore the landmass is different too. I would love to see a globe for each of these ages, just to get some idea as to what the planet actually looked like. I mean, to a certain degree you can, but you got the Perry Reese map that shows the outline of Antarctic and heaven knows where they got it from, but it seems to be accurate. And so if you could see the globe as it was in each of these time frames, you get a better idea as to where civilization might have been. And certainly South America is one of those places.
Right.
It makes great sense that Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. And to answer your question, those maps don't exist prior to what I'm proposing was this pole shift 18,000 years ago. But since then, there are maps of, there are pretty good estimates. Well, even going back before then, there are estimates of the height of the Earth's oceans. And you're exactly right that it's inversely related to the amount of ice. The more ice you have, the lower the sea level is. And during the last glacial maximum, that's when there was the most ice on the North American continent. The ocean levels were at like a near record low. Over the last, about 100,000 years ago, they were almost as low, but they were pretty low like 20,000 years ago. At this point in time, what is now the Persian Gulf? Visualize like where Iran, Iraq, Straits of Hormuz, and you go down and then to the east is India. That whole area, that body of water did not exist. It was all dry land. And so you had this vast area now that is covered with water, but was once above water. And what they found back in the late 90s was a submerged civilization off the coast of India in what's now the Bay of Cambay. And I actually have an article on this on beforeatlantis.com. It's the last article I wrote. It's right at the top, and it shows what the water levels were at that time. It shows where these sites are located, and it actually makes the case that there was a civilization that existed before the Indus Valley or the Harappan civilization. It used to be thought that India was only civilized when the Aryans moved in, but then that whole theory was displaced by when they discovered evidence of this Indus Valley civilization that spread, that existed, thousands of years ago along the Indus River from northern India into Pakistan and west. But these submerged structures off the bay, in the Bay of Cambay, could have only have been built when the land was above water, and that was like 20,000 years ago. So this is almost like you've seen Bob Ballard's discoveries in the Bosphorus and the Black Sea, these submerged structures, and that were maybe a few extra thousand years older than we think they are. Well, these sites in India could be 1,000 years older than the earliest sites discovered from this Indus Valley civilization, which itself, archaeologists don't know where it came from. They don't know where the Indus Valley civilization originated. It seemed to have just sort of sprung up overnight. And so finding these submerged structures that, based on sonar imagery, look like those on dry land in places like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and other places like that, suggests that the Indus Valley culture was really a carryover, an extension of what existed prior to that. And I mean, this is just, to your point, this is just one part of the world. But I think, there's a lot to be discovered just based on, looking at when the oceans were lower, what did it reveal? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean the coastline of North America has changed dramatically, and with and is continuing to. I mean, there are parts of Florida that are kind of sinking lower and lower, so that it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it does look like if the ice melt continues that the ocean's coming up, and in 1,000 years or so, our coastline will be very different. And
Miami. Miami will be an
Sorry,
go ahead.
it brings to mind that sunken structure off the coast of Japan. One wonders what it actually was, and was it ever above ground?
Right.
The Yamaguchi.
Yamaguchi. Yeah.
No, it's not. No, that's Yamaguchi is the treasure. But there is that island, not island, but there is that structure off the coast of Japan that they're arguing over whether it was man-made or not, and it sure looks man-made to me.
Right. And the fact that it at one time would have been above water suggests the possibility that it was part of a structure, a man-made structure.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're right. I mean, the city of Miami will, at the rate we're going, will be an archaeological, a submerged archaeological site in probably 100 years. At least parts of it will be.
But it also gives greater credence to the fact that the Bimini Road maybe actually was a road at one point in time.
Right, and Plato talks about the area around Atlantis being an impenetrable sea. Well, when the during the glacial max, when there was the most ice and the water levels were at their lowest, the Caribbean was not a wide open sea the way it is today. The islands were much larger. The Yucatan Peninsula was much, the land area was significantly greater. There was still water, but I mean, what you're mentioning in in the Bahamas, much of that area would have been above water, and so you're exactly right. The Bimini Road was above water at that point.
I think when you talk about stuff like this, it makes it so much more logical, and people kind of play I doubt it with these kind of thoughts, but when you look at the fact that the pole was different, the ice mass determined the depth of the oceans or the extent of the oceans. I mean, it makes it all so much more plausible that there was civilization here. Don't know what it was or who it was, but they've spotted, especially in the Bermuda Triangle, they've spotted whoever they are. Pyramids underwater.
Right.
So, where did they come from? But when you go with your theory about the shifting mantle, the shifting poles, and the ice is melting and forming, I mean, it does give you a whole new topography to what humanity had to live with and to work with, and therefore there were probably magical cultures that were totally destroyed that we have no knowledge of, and nor will we ever probably, but maybe there are remains of buildings and things like that at some point in time can be uncovered. I wanted to touch on Göbekli Tepe because that's one of my topics that I seem to be drawn to of late, and the fact that it's 20 acres of ruins that only a small part have been excavated. Is there any way of determining, which area, which pole that was constructed in?
I haven't followed that line of research. Apparently, it's an area that's been a little dangerous to work in lately. I don't know. But it's just in that part of the world. What I've heard that is some astronomical alignments to stars perhaps might have been determined. So structures, and this is something that I haven't talked about very much. I've talked about, we talked in this conversation today, we talked about alignments to the cardinal directions. I've alluded a little bit to solstices, places like Stonehenge that have, alignments that reference sun, the first day of summer, first day of winter, that sort of thing. I've talked about. There's also many places that reference the moon, lunar temples, and you find megalithic sites in the UK, for example, have many such references. A lot of sites in Egypt are thought to have been aligned to the stars, and that's a very popular hypothesis in archaeoastronomy, that a site was aligned to the rising of a particular star. One example is the Temple of Hathor in Egypt could have been aligned to the rising of the Milky Way, because Hathor is the mother goddess. The Milky Way, the Big Dipper, is a reference to a similar idea, and so there's that connection in Egypt. And relative to Göbekli Tepe, there's I only heard about this in passing, that there's appear to be some references to stars in the alignments there. So again, that sort of just echoes this long, it's like a universal quality, it seems, of humanity, that we reference the heavens in our constructions.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that it there's so much wonderful knowledge out there today that wasn't out there 10 years ago, and forget 20 and 30 years ago, and while it's still evolving, it's a shame that we aren't teaching it to children, because it gives you a greater sense of respect for who and what we are and where we come from. And I with all due respect to anybody who is heavily into the Bible, I do believe that we have evolved in ways different than has been taught to our children, and that we have the capacity to do so much more than we're actually doing, and it's a matter of society allowing us the freedom to go where no man's gone before, so to speak, to quote Star Trek.
Yeah.
The concept of there being another culture, another I don't want to say species, because I do feel that there was a civilization, a better way to put it. Somebody I interviewed lately said that Atlantis wasn't necessarily an island as much as it was a culture.
Yes.
And that their technology evolved and was basically wiped out at some point in time, but that remnants of it remained, and therefore, were the contractors, so to speak, of many of the megalithic structures that we'd have no explanation for. And I mean, you call them I'll pronounce it wrong, the Nakal?
Yeah, I mean, some people like to just use the term Atlanteans, but I actually picked a term out that a sort of Victorian era archaeologist used. There was an archaeologist by the name of Augustus Laplegione who was a photographer. He lived most of his life in South and Central America, and he documented extensively the ruins in Mesoamerica. And he had developed sort of his own understanding or translation of the Mayan glyphs, and he believed that they spoke of cataclysms, sort of echoing the Egyptian version of Atlantis. There's sort of a similar version as told from those on the other side of the Atlantic. Sorry, I just lost my I had a phone ringing here and I lost my train of thought.
Where the term came from,
sorry,
the Nakal.
Right, sorry. And he used the term he came up with this term almost out of thin air. I tried to do a little research on the etymology, and it seemed like just something that he sort of picked out of the air. But he talked about, and so did Churchward, who, he was the guy that proposed the idea of the lost continent of Mu in the middle of the Pacific. And they believe that there was an ancient race of wise men called the Naga, N-A-G-A, that came from Mesoamerica. They believe Mesoamerica was sort of the cradle of civilization, and they migrated both east and west. And anyway, so he refers to these people as the Nakal, and so that's why you think that was not. I didn't want to tie it to Atlantis per se. I wanted it to be something that maybe might have been a little bit, maybe even predating, and not only just predating, but also being something maybe more global in scope than just that time and that place. So, but it's arbitrary. You can call them. I mean, some people like to think of them as Denisovans, but that's again getting into this whole idea that it was a different species, and and some people believe that they were aliens, that they were ancient extraterrestrials that came here and they were responsible for all of this, and they were responsible for us, and
well, it would make things a lot easier, wouldn't it? A spaceship, It's kind of like it got shipwrecked and its survivors created where we are today. I mean, that would explain it all. But it's much more fun to think of a highly technological. I mean, actually, we have changed as we have evolved. So a highly technical culture could easily have been wiped out by the plague or something like that, and that the few remaining survivors just migrated to different parts of the planet and started their own civilization. I mean, it could, kind of the easiest answer is often the one that is the most probable, but you get somebody who has technology above and beyond what most other people have. I mean, look at the Coral Castle. Now, if we had that technology that he used to build the Coral Castle, and he did say in his book that he used the same technology the Egyptians used with building the pyramids, it would make sense. He was lifting massive stones.
Now, Coral Castle is where?
In Florida.
Oh, okay.
And are you familiar with it at all?
No. I'm not.
The Coral Castle is literally a castle that one man created, and he lifted these huge boulders and whatever without a crane, without anything, but nobody saw him build it. And he was moving mammoth rocks, and he carved these rocks all by himself. The story goes he was building it for a lady who he was in love with who never came, but he built this castle anyhow, and it's built out of very hard rock, very heavy rock, and he had no power tools that I know of. And
yes, so he had the power. He had the power of love.
And that's a big power. Yes, absolutely.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean
but
to
he has.
So
that's okay.
He erected this. How did he get the stones erected and so forth?
Nobody knows. He didn't do it when anybody was watching. Nobody knows, and to this day it is a mystery. And people tried to spy on him, and they think it had something to do with magnetism of a sort. But he had no cranes, he had no bulldozers, he had no plows. And Google it and take a look at it. It's pretty amazing. But so what I'm saying is that if you have that knowledge inside of you, you can create amazing things. And he clearly had found a secret that he took with him to the grave, unfortunately. But when you talk about advanced civilizations and surviving with technology, my big thing is, you want to leave a record of some sort, and yet the record of your existence has been turned into, if in case this is the case, if in case your summation is appropriate, and I see no reason why it's not, then those survivors created the foundation of the mythology that has survived to this day.
Mm-hmm.
They were powerful. They had magical powers, and they became the Norse gods and the Greeks and the Roman gods, and they became, probably it would horrify them if they were alive today to think of what they've done, what was done with their memory, so to speak. That people did not understand them and therefore made them gods, and then when they were gone, they elevated them even higher. I mean, that's a possibility, and yet their structures remain to be testimony to their ability to create things of immense beauty and size, and didn't bring their technology with them, just the memory of them as people.
And the reason that spiritual and esoteric and mythological sources are so interesting is that this is exactly what they talk about, that there were prior ages preceding us. In the Iron Age was the Bronze Age and the Silver Age and the Golden Age, or the different yugas. We're in the Kali Yuga,
Mm-hmm.
but it all began during the Sat Yuga, the Golden Age, that where we lived to be thousands of years old, and it was a life of milk. It was a land of milk and honey, and then there was a gradual decline in morality, human morality. Life became harder, and it suggests, and this is exactly the sort of thing you see reflected in the architecture, that the oldest is the most sophisticated. So there's
Mm-hmm.
there has to be an element of the explanation. It can't be ignored. But exactly what the right answer is still something that we're trying to figure out. But at least
you look at
what I attempted to do in Atlantis is say, hey, look, there might actually be an archaeological / geometrical for going back more than 10,000 years, because 10,000 years isn't enough. We kind of know what was going on 10,000 years ago. It's like, what happened before that? Well, we don't have any real artifacts that we know of, but if these alignments if this turns out to be valid, then these alignments are testament to the age of these structures and to the ages during which they were built. And I think that could be a new start for investigation, if that is provided that archaeologists and scientists or whoever's in charge want to do that. I think part of us, part of our destiny as human beings is to remain in darkness. It certainly seems to be true for part of the population seems to be happy with fear and loathing in Las Vegas. Whereas others are more interested in following the light and learning about things the way they really are, and not being shedding this veil of darkness and illusion and the Maya, this plane that we exist in. And knowledge is a way of doing it. And I don't know to what extent we'll be successful. Maybe some people will gain some insight. And to the extent that's possible, then I think that justifies what we're doing, because we're doing what we feel is necessary. But, honestly, I feel almost like a little passionate about it. It's like, I'm going to throw it against the wall, and if it sticks, that's great. If it doesn't, if people don't, buy it, then that's fine. I'm not going to try to convince them. But maybe there'll be something in what I do, because I've seen work others have done, and that's given me clues. And piecing it all together, maybe it'll lead eventually to some new hypotheses and some new insights.
Oh, probably. And my purpose of this show is to, Nightlight was not a random thought to call the show, is to provide a beacon of light and to put stuff out there. And if we've only made one person think and question and research, then my work here is done. It's sort of like challenge. Ask why. I mean, if you had an explanation of who and what God was and could convince me, my next question would be, and who made him?
That's right.
You have to go further. You can't just sit back and say, okay, that was the end and that was the beginning, because looking for the real beginning is fascinating. And I think that you've absolutely given a terrific premise to look into and to investigate and to stretch, because I am much more comfortable with seeing the consciousness or the of higher technology being spread than a single island that sank in the Atlantic. It makes more sense to me that it was a consciousness rather than an island, that there was a higher technology, and where did it come from? It appears that it came from Mesoamerica, but where did it come from before then? But let's validate that it existed first before we ask where they came from, because that could be a spaceship, who knows? But we might have been a prison planet for all I know. But
that's right.
But and there a long time ago was a theory that life started here on this planet because a spaceship was going by and they dumped their septic system and it landed on the planet, and we are the result of the biological stuff that a passing spaceship dumped on us. So there are lots of different.
Yeah.
I read a story.
Yeah.
but
I'll bet. That's a less flattering description of what the planetary scientists call panspermia, right?
Yeah. Yes, but sometimes the simplest answer is the logical one. But it's sort of like you come on, it could be as simple as that. And if it is, then who drove the spaceship and why? It's I want to know. I want to know where we come from, and I think we come from we come from a seed, a source that had abilities far beyond what we have now. And if there is a link back to that culture, that species, I want to know how to turn on those aspects of my DNA so that I can reach into some of that information that is undoubtedly still there. So it's kind of like in a way it's selfish. If I carry a source like that inside of me, I want to know how to access it. It's like having a library and not being able to find the door. Mm-hmm. And my glasses, because both are required to access information. But
I know what you mean.
I think that your theory is amazing. I wish to heck that they had uncovered all 20 acres of Göbekli Tepe, because then you'd really know what is the oldest, and then you'd be able to kind of play with it a little bit. But apparently they're saving the best for last, which just drives me crazy. I'd be in there with a shovel and a heartbeat. I just
think that it's just sort of like the latest. It's still relatively safe. It's a relatively safe hypothesis because it keeps us. 10,000 years ago, it's when a lot of stuff started popping on the planet. It's like it's still safe, but I don't know. I guess you have to kind of pick your not your. I'm trying to think of a good euphemism, but maybe maybe there isn't one. But I just want to sort of focus on something maybe a little different, because I think archaeologists are probably going to start, embracing Göbekli Tepe as sort of like now a default hypothesis. But like what you and I are talking, the things we're talking about, it doesn't go back far enough. So okay, it's a starting point, but it might be a bit of a not a red herring, but a distraction to think that we're going to learn everything we're going to need to know from it. I think we've got to look at other sites across the world. I think, they say even planetary scientists now are beginning to acknowledge the possibility that there might be evidence of extraterrestrial life on Mars, but it would be buried very deeply. And that's the idea that the really interesting things I think on Earth are going to be like anywhere else will be buried deeply, because the oldest stuff is the deepest. And that's
just
kind of
like
where I'm
clams,
going in my research.
Every grain of knowledge in a clam, eventually, over a long period of time for the clam, creates a pearl. And so you've got little pieces of grains of wisdom here, and over time, I'm sure that they will create a pearl of wisdom of some sort that leads someone to a deeper understanding, who will then turn around and say, and what came before this?
Right.
Hopefully there's never an end to it. I just noticed the time, and I do apologize. You did ask for a break, and I didn't give it to you.
No, it's fine. It's okay. Well, I'm good.
I want to thank you so much. This was so much fun, and your book was, it's not a long book, but it holds so much material that you have to go back and reread, and highly recommended. It's on Amazon, and your website. I'm sorry. You want to tell me your website again? I didn't write it down here.
Yeah, it's beforeatlantis.com. One word.
Okay.
And there's a lot of articles. There's a lot of information on the website. And if people, they don't want to buy the book, that's fine. They can get a lot of information on the website, and they get a pretty good idea of what it's all about from that. So.
The book is a great read. I highly recommend it.
Thanks,
and the pictures, the graphics are gorgeous too. But I want to thank you again, and we'll talk again, I'm sure. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you everybody for listening and sharing. I hope that we have challenged you and enlightened you. And if you don't agree, fine, research and prove it wrong. And if you do agree, research it and get enlightened. Whatever floats your boat. But the important thing is question things, challenge things, investigate things. Don't let a textbook determine the limits of your potential. So that said, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Mark, again. You've been amazing. And tune in tomorrow. And also follow us on YouTube and Rumble. We're on Rumble now. And if you like what you see, please subscribe or follow, whichever is appropriate on either of those. Look forward to hearing from you, because if you don't let us know you're out there, we'll keep talking anyhow, but it's nice to know you're there. Take care, everybody. Have a great one.